Well, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us. This is only our second central teaching evening that we're doing, but thank you very much for coming this evening. Delighted to have Matt and Liz. So Matt's a vicar down in Formby. Liz is married to Matt, but Liz is also... what is your title? Do you want to come and tell us what your title actually is?
I'm a consultant geriatrician. I work on a frailty unit, so lots of vulnerable older adults.
Fantastic. I'll ask you a couple more questions in a minute. But just to say how this evening is going to work, I'm going to pretty much hand over to Matt and Liz. So we're going to be in their hands. You've got paper and you've got pens on the table. You might want to kind of scribble things down. There's kind of stuff on the screen as well. We are going to have a time for questions, but I think we'll probably do that at the end. But if you do have a kind of burning question, you can write that down. If you feel that you are not wanting to sort of kind of stick your hand up and sort of ask that question publicly, you can just put it on the paper, and we'll have a time when we can collect questions that are on tables if you want. We've not got a pigeonhole and things set up tonight, so that's probably how we'll do questions. But do you just tell us a little bit about St Luke's, Formby, being a consultant geriatrician? How long have you been there? What are you doing? All that kind of
we've been in kind of Liverpool Diocese since 2016, so I think a year before Andy. So like Andy, I came here to be a curate, ended up moving around 2 different churches in Liverpool, and then became vicar at St Luke's, which is a lovely place, Formby. We're right beside the pine woods, the beach, all that kind of stuff. We've got a lovely set of folk there who are... Certainly, the older folk are very gospel-minded, loving getting into the Bible, getting to grips with that. So we're involved with the local diocesan evangelical fellowship, which I know Andy's involved with, and Northwest Gospel Partnership, and things like that. So it's, I'm trying to think, great place. We've got a church school, so we have lots of links with children through that. And really, other than that, it's probably similar to here, kind of suburban, lots of houses. Lots of people who don't yet know Jesus, but it's our prayer and our hope that we're going to be able to reach them and more people come and trust in him.
Fantastic. Liz, do you want to tell us, are you going to say, as you go on, a little bit about your sort of background, medical background, or do you want to say that now?
So I think the reason people ask me to talk about this is a couple of different things. So I'm a geriatrician. I was involved last year quite heavily with our National Society rewriting their position statement on assisted dying. So we've done a heck of a lot of evidence reviewing over the past year. And I'm also involved with a campaign called Our Duty of Care, which some of you might be familiar with, which is healthcare professionals of all faiths and none who are opposed to what we perceive as the intentional killing of our patients. And so we're kind of trying to work together to look at safeguards and various other concerns that there are around the bill. So yeah, that's kind of more of a personal thing than a professional thing. So I've been deliberately a bit vague about where I'm from because my work are not keen for me to associate with them, with my political opinions.
Great. I should say we are recording this evening, but it's not going to be a publicly available live stream. So 1 or 2 people I think will have asked for it, and they can have the link for it. But we're not going to make for that very reason. We're just not going to make it available for everybody to see this, which might kind of mean that you kind of feel a little freer to ask questions as well. This evening as well. Shall I pray and then hand straight over to you guys? Great. Heavenly Father, we thank you. We thank you for Matt. We thank you for Liz. Thank you for their clear faith in the Lord Jesus and how you've used them and equipped them for their different roles as a pastor, but as a medic as well. Father, we pray that you'd help us to humbly listen to your word this evening. Help us to engage well with what you're saying. Help us to ask good questions. Father, please, would you renew our minds? Would you shape our thinking so that we might live rightly and engage rightly in the world and in the situations that you place us? So please help us this evening, we pray, for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Great. Do you want there you go. Just click along.
Apologise, hopefully it's not going to be death by PowerPoint, but as a doctor I don't really give talks without PowerPoints, so bear with me, it's my safety blanket. So this is roughly where we're going tonight, so you can figure out where we are along the way, if I actually click the slide. So we're going to recognise our own experiences, and we're going to think a little bit about the definitions of what's actually involved and where this has come from historically, where we are now in terms of our cultural moment, and how we think God is speaking into that particular cultural moment, because we believe, don't we, that the word of the Lord is timeless, and that it speaks into any and every situation that we encounter. I'm going to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the actual bill itself, because if you are thoughtful people who want to engage with it, you need to understand that. And I'm going to highlight some of the problems and concerns. We may skate through some of them because I get quite enthusiastic. There are just so many problems. Even if you agree with assisted dying, this bill is dreadful. It's an awful piece of legislation. And then we'll talk a bit about what you can do, and there'll be some time for questions. I tried to be clever and do Slido, but we were so disorganised and late that you don't have Slido on your thing, which is why you're going to have to either be very timid and put your hands up if you're feeling brave, or write your questions down on a piece of paper for me later. A couple of evenings ago, before bed, I was talking to our youngest, and we were reading Luke 12, the parable that Jesus tells of the rich fool who's busy building up things in his barn and gathering all his stores, and he's going to sit back and enjoy life. And Jesus says, "You fool, tonight your life will be demanded from you." And we were reading it in a children's Bible, which sort of suggested the man might have sort of rolled over and gone to sleep. And Timothy turned to me and said, "I want to die like that." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, because then I won't know anything about it." And actually, I think our 7-year-old articulated what a lot of us feel, certainly out there, probably in here as well. Actually, we'd really just like to die peacefully, turn over in our sleep, blissfully unaware of what's going on. And actually, that's part of the moment into which we're speaking. We do want to say a big thank you for inviting us to come and speak. We're really conscious. We've felt the burden of coming to talk about this, that we're not talking about theoretical subjects, that within this room there will be people who have experienced good deaths, and there'll be people in this room who've experienced bad deaths. There'll be people here whose lives have been touched either personally or by close family or friends by suicide or attempted suicide. And that there may well be people here living with conditions for which there is no cure and for which there is really significant suffering. And so what I want to say to you is, please forgive us if we inadvertently say something that is upsetting to you. We've tried really hard tonight to think about what we're saying and to say it in a way that is not hurtful. And I wanted to start really with this quotation from John Wyatt, who is actually a professor of neonatology, but he's a Christian who's spent a lot of his life talking about medical ethics, and some of you may have read his books, and Andy's got one on the back that we'll plug later. But it says this: if we're followers of Christ, then it is first our responsibility to empathise, to try to comprehend and to enter into the human suffering, fear and desperation that many people face at the end of life. We should talk about these issues not with condemnation, judgment and rhetoric and voices, but with tears in our eyes. So with that in mind, we were going to start off with a little poll, but we can't do that because it won't load here. We're going to get into smaller groups now. Just have 5 minutes to say hello to each other. Hopefully you know each other's names. If for whatever reason you've forgotten, now's the moment. I've given you permission to ask somebody else's name. And just have a chat together. As much as you're prepared to share, do you have experience of death and dying? Is that a positive thing, a negative thing? Are you professionally involved in this? I heard rumours there might be professionals, which always makes me even more nervous. But also, how do you feel about death and dying as we come to approach this topic tonight? So we've probably got 4 or 5 minutes just to sit and have a natter. And if everybody talks, nobody will feel like they're being heard. So that's good. I'll interrupt you again now and we'll crack on. I feel slightly in the dark, but I'm not going to make you tell me what you were talking about. So hopefully that's sort of warmed us up a little bit for what we're going to talk about this evening. It's a bit of a doctor thing to do to start with definitions, but our words really matter. These are two slogans from some of the big campaign groups. So on your right-hand side, we've got Dignity in Dying, who are turning over in excess of £2 million a year in their campaign for this through Companies House. And they used to be the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, but people didn't like that name. So Dignity in Dying is what they're now called. And their big thing is we are fighting for choice. People are being forced to suffer. And that's really emotive language, isn't it? But I think our duty of care can also be accused of what people perceive to be emotive language, although it's certainly factual, that our duty of care as a group of healthcare professionals opposed to the intentional killing of patients by assisted suicide. The argument goes from the American Medical Association that we need to call it assisted suicide because that's what it is. And the argument in the UK says, well, we ought to be calling it that because this overturns the Suicide Act of 1961. And we'll think about that a little bit later. Loads of different terms. Assisted dying is a fairly good umbrella term. Oh, sorry, clicked the wrong thing. Is a fairly good umbrella term, which basically tries to encompass all the different ways that healthcare professionals might be involved in helping somebody to end their life. The issue under debate in Parliament at the moment is physician-assisted suicide, or assisted dying as they're calling it, but is a very specific situation where a healthcare professional will prescribe a lethal cocktail of medication within defined criteria at the voluntary request of an adult patient who has the mental capacity to make that request in order that they can administer those drugs themselves. There is a second thing called voluntary active euthanasia, which is actually referenced in the bill, although not really what they said they were talking about, which is basically where a doctor could give medication to the patient, again, within those same defined criteria. But let's be clear, assisted dying, which in the polling has caused some real confusion, is not normal care and help for people who are dying, which is a major part of my job day in, day out, and a major part of healthcare across the UK. Assisted dying is the intentional planning, preparation, and assistance of suicide, which is currently a serious criminal offence under the 1961 Suicide Act. So this bill is pretty seismic in what it's seeking to do because it is overturning a major criminal thing that's been in law for a long time. I don't know if anybody recognises William Temple. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 40s. He's quite a wise owl. And he said, if we don't know where you're going, sometimes it's helpful to know where you've been. And I've stolen this from John Wyatt because I think it is really useful for you to understand the current discussion in the context of what's gone on years before. So to tell you a very old story, some of you might recognise this picture, which is the death of Socrates. It's a painting where he was preparing to drink hemlock because he'd been convicted of corrupting the youth. And Socrates and Plato, along with a few of the other philosophers of that time, were very pro-euthanasia, coming from that Greek root of eu meaning good and thanatos meaning death. But Hippocrates, as you might imagine, with the Hippocratic Oath, was vehemently opposed to the practice, and things went pretty quiet for a while after that. If we scooch forward, she says, not quite that far, if we scooch forward to the late 19th century, anaesthetic agents were coming in. I promise it's not going to be a brief history of medicine, but anaesthetic agents were coming in. And there's here we go. There we go. There was a school teacher who wrote an opinion piece about this, was obviously very excited by modern technology, presumably not professionally. And he suggested it would be great to use chloroform to put people out there suffering permanently. He was sort of closely followed by a lady called Annie Besant, who sort of coined this concept of a rational suicide, and that's again something that's quite big in the bill at the moment, this idea that Not all suicide attempts are equal. So some people are irrational in their desire for suicide and others are rational in their desire. And we may touch on that later in questions if people want to explore that further. The utilitarianism sort of movement, without wanting to reduce that completely, was essentially about minimizing pain and maximizing good. And that really fed into the eugenics that developed in Victorian Britain. And alongside those eugenics were sort of big calls for euthanasia. And Dr. Charles Goddard, who was the Medical Officer for Health in London, was a big advocate of both eugenics and euthanasia, not only for those with inaccessible and therefore inoperable malignancy, which you might recognise as a sort of similar argument today, but also for those deemed to be mentally defective and those not serving any useful purpose. And abhorrent though that statement is, it is at least ethically consistent. There's no arbitrary 6 months on your suffering. There's no arbitrary, some people are worth things and other people aren't worth things. In the sort of early 20s and then early 30s, Prof. Richard Berry and Dr. Treadgold, who was an eminent neurologist, both came up with this idea of lethal chambers for people suffering from severe mental defects to exterminate the low-grade defectives. And the Voluntary Euthanasia Society was born in 1936, which is now what's been rebranded Death in Dying, or Dignity in Dying, sorry. And they submitted a bill shortly before the Second World War to the Lords, which was roundly defeated. But actually, we have Nazi Germany to thank for the slowing of this movement in the UK. Because as things were ramping up before the Second World War started, a couple of professors, Binding and Hock, who came from a sort of medical legal background, wrote a paper entitled Permission for the Destruction of a Worthless Life. And that was followed by Hitler's own personal physician, Karl Brandt's Actien T4 euthanasia program, which you may have learned about at school, where they exterminated over 275,000 people, from newborns all the way up to the elderly, who were all deemed to have lives not worth living. And because of the abhorrence of everything that happened in the Second World War and what came out in the Nuremberg trials, that really is why euthanasia sort of halted in the UK, because of all that came out. And this chap here is a psychiatrist from America who was part of the Nuremberg trials. And I've included this quotation because I think it's really relevant. He commented, "It started with acceptance by doctors of the idea, basic in the euthanasia movement, that there is such a thing as a life not worthy to be lived. This attitude in the beginning referred to the severely and chronically sick, read those with 6 months or less to live. Gradually, the sphere of those to be included was enlarged to encompass the socially unproductive, the ideologically unwanted, the racially unwanted, but it is important to realise the infinitely small lever from which this entire trend of mind received its impetus was the attitude towards the incurably sick." So if we scoot forward a bit further again in the 20th century, I'm just going to briefly mention the Netherlands, Oregon and Switzerland, which many of you will be familiar with. And the reason I've chosen those three is because they've all adopted a slightly different approach to this. So the Netherlands developed their sort of cultural change all around the idea of suffering and unbearable suffering. And although euthanasia wasn't legalized until early this century there, since the 1980s, doctors have been able to end someone's life if they are unable to alleviate suffering in any other way, which is a slightly alarming concept. They have also been the forerunners in terms of looking at something called the Completed Life Bill, which is for anybody 75 years old and over. No idea why 75 is when you've completed your life, but anybody 75 years and older who decides that they've had enough. Don't need to have anything particularly wrong with you, you just feel like you've lived a full life. That's not yet gone through Parliament there. It was first tabled in 2020 and it keeps being brought back every year, and the anticipation is that will go through sometime in the next 5 years. Netherlands have also brought out some other pretty interesting papers around euthanasia. So the Groningen Protocol was actually published in the New England Journal of Medicine and is a neonatal euthanasia schedule. If we think about Oregon, they had a very different approach, a much more modern and inverted commas approach. their Death with Dignity Act that was in the late 90s, and I got questioned about at medical school, it was all around a right to die. It was around choosing, being able to choose to die in a way that you perceive to be dignified. Although subsequently they are one of the only territories that produce any data on modes of death and on complications. And although Kim Ledbetter initially touted Oregon as the place to look at because she doesn't feel that they've slid in their criteria, the data that's come out around how one might die and how long it might take one to die, and the fact that actually you might not have a peaceful death with this cocktail of unproven medication, has made the government swing slightly away from Oregon. And then finally, Switzerland. The reason Switzerland are in, they've done things very differently. So they've said you can't have doctors involved in this, that physicians cannot be the people who administer this medication. Healthcare professionals can't be the ones to administer this medication. And it's been legal in Switzerland since 1941. As long as you've got no vested interest legally and you're not a doctor giving the medicine, then it's okay. All of us, I think, will have heard of Dignitas and some of the heart-rending stories of people who've made that journey feeling that they had no other choice. And actually, the vast majority of people are from abroad. So it's mostly Germans, then the Brits, are the sort of two biggest users of Dignitas. To give them their due, again, ethically consistent, Ludwig Manelli gave this quotation probably a decade or so ago now, but he says, if you accept the idea of personal autonomy, you can't make conditions that only terminally ill people should have this right. With life expectancy growing, medical sophistication improving, people are increasingly worried about whether they'll be condemned to linger on, forced to end their lives in an institution. Our members say, well, with our pets, when they're old and in pain, we help them. Why can't I get to a vet? And as I say, to give him his due, he's ethically consistent. And I think this is one of the things that the government is sort of sleepwalking into, saying it's only for a very defined point of people. But Canada's shown us that it's only a matter of time before we argue for ethical consistency within the courts. And actually that becomes anybody at any time for any reason. So just to sort of scoot back to the UK then, and then I promise you'll get a break from my voice because Matt's coming soon. The Voluntary Euthanasia Society reattempted that law. There was a loss of support, as I mentioned earlier, post-war after the horrors that came out from Nazi Germany particularly. And although somebody tried in the 1950s to get the bill through again, it was roundly defeated in the House of Lords. You've heard me mention the Suicide Act in 1961, which removed all legal penalties for attempted suicide, and I would suggest rightly so. But it maintained that it was a criminal offence to assist suicide in any way. And that is one of the bits that advocates for euthanasia and assisted dying have railed against, but it's also a protection when we think about things like domestic violence and the frail elderly. The Voluntary Euthanasia Society really did become a bad taste in people's mouth because in response to the Suicide Act, a decade later, they published a guide to self-deliverance, which was essentially how to kill yourself for dummies. And it listed the most effective methods. That really is what sort of squashed assisted dying in the UK for the next sort of 20 or 30 years. And it wasn't really until the late 90s that people started to think, oh, maybe this is something we need to reassess. So the modern attempts really over the past quarter of a century or so have focused on physician-assisted suicide and not euthanasia, as people feel that's more palatable if you take the medication yourself. They've really majored on freedom and choice, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. They've tried to distance themselves from the Netherlands and Belgium with their sort of modern services. And then you'll recognise these names from the news over the past couple of decades. Lord Joffrey's bill, which was defeated, Lord Falconer's bill, which was defeated, an attempt in Scotland in 2015, and then the MacArthur bill, which is the Scottish version of the Kim Ledbetter's bill. So Kim Ledbetter's would cover England and Wales, and the MacArthur bill would cover Scotland. So, it's over to Matt. I told you you'd get a change of voice.
Great. Well, Liz has spent quite a lot of time telling you things, and I'm aware that sometimes when you're just sitting there, it's like a history lesson, it just kind of washes over you. Maybe you've had decaf coffee and you're feeling a little bit sleepy. I'm a little bit more lazy, so I'm going to get you guys to do all the work now. Is that okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to first look at two passages in the Bible. There's a passage in Judges where it talks about a bloke called Abimelech. That's Gideon's son. And then we're going to look at Saul, who was the first king of Israel. And we're going to look at how they died. And I want you to have a look at how they died, and then just chat with each other about, I guess, well, to give you a hint, there's a bit of assisted suicide going on in both cases. So I was just going to say, does somebody want to maybe shout out a page number for Judges chapter 9? Whoever's fastest to get there. Say it again? 253. Why don't I read quickly, and then we'll get... So I've just looked at 253 in my Bible. It's got completely different numbers and wondered why I couldn't read the right thing. Judges chapter 9. So let's see, 52 to 55. So basically Abimelech, he's besieged somewhere, and it says this in verse 52. Abimelech went to the tower and attacked it. But as he approached the entrance to the tower to set it on fire, a woman dropped an upper millstone on his head and cracked his skull. Hurriedly, he called his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me, so that they can't say, 'A woman killed him.'" So his servant ran him through, and he died. When the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they went home. Okay. So have a little think around your tables. What do you notice about that passage? What was the reasons? Is there any of that kind of correlates a bit with people's reasons today? I know maybe there's a slightly sexist bit, but hopefully some of that's transferable. Have a little think, have a little chat. I'll interrupt you in a minute. everyone here. Okay, I'll interrupt you. We'll feed back all together. So, actually, no, we'll feed back now because otherwise you'll have fingers in multiple Bible passages. So, Judges chapter 9. Why is it that Abimelech wanted to die? Is this going to be on? Hands up. Any thoughts? What were his reasons? Oh, don't worry. We'll just get the volume in a second.
I'm not answering.
Thank you. It just says, doesn't it, so that they can't say a woman killed him.
Yeah.
Which is surprising.
Surprising. Well, what do you think that touches on? Pride. Yeah. It touches on your pride. Anything?
Pride.
Pride. Thank you. There is that aspect of kind of dignity, isn't it? Your pride, your dignity. I want to die a dignified death. I don't want some woman to have killed me. I prefer to have suggested to someone else that they run me through instead, because in his mind, that's more dignified than having a woman kill him. Okay, so it's that aspect. Let's look at 2 Samuel chapter 1. Does someone want to? Yeah, go for it. Sorry.
We found that wasn't from a sexist point of view.
Yes.
Talked about he was obviously
Great.
he was obviously used to being in control. He was powerful and he wanted to be in control of his own
Thank you.
life.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, that's really helpful. There's that aspect of autonomy, of wanting to be in control, wanting to be able to say how he died, not being happy that his skull's crushed and he's about to die anyway, but wanted to do that. And let's see if we nip on to then, so 2 Samuel chapter 1, when someone finds a page number, do you want to shout it out? 304 was that? Great. I feel a bit like a bingo caller or something. So 304. 2 Samuel chapter 1. Let's see, verses 6 to 9. So basically, Saul has just been killed in battle. Him and David aren't getting on at the moment, but news makes itself back to David. And there's a person brings the report to David, and it says, "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and the drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned round and saw me, he called out to me and I said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.'" So, what's going on? Have a little think around your tables, and I'll pull you back together in a minute.
There's obviously a ability of gaining something here.
Yeah.
He would be the one who has the crown and goes back with it. So there's some gain ahead.
For the Amalekite? Yeah. And actually, there's an interesting thing there, isn't it? In verse 10, he says, "So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them here to my Lord." You could say there's compassion there, isn't there? This guy was suffering. Let's put him out of his suffering. Let's stop his suffering. Let's speed up his death. He's maybe not quite got 6 months. He's maybe got 6 hours to die. That would be a lot of suffering. Let's speed it up, and let's help in that way. So the Old Testament is aware of this idea of assisted suicide, you could call it, couldn't you? There's people who have had that, who have experienced that, who have helped with that in the Old Testament. Right, I'm going to hand back to Liz.
Yeah, so I guess I wanted to talk about our cultural moment, and I think we often get quite carried away, don't we, in thinking, our cultural moment is the most enlightened, the most excited. And actually what Matt's shown us is that actually these issues around control and dignity and choice are age-old in lots of ways. But it is fair to say that over the past century there's been a huge change as our culture has become more post-Christian. We have moved away from a central ethic of love as our main motivator behind legislation and societal action, and moved much more towards autonomy, where I get to decide my truth, my story. And I guess alongside that, we've dispensed with the sanctity of life. Life is no longer sacred. We no longer see a creator who made us in his image, and we no longer see value in people as image bearers. You're valuable because of what you can do. And that harks back, doesn't it, to some of those appalling things that we saw from the turn of the 20th century, 19th, 20th century, where people were deemed not making valuable contributions and therefore reasonable to be dispensed with. And the right to choose sort of goes alongside that, because although the right to choose sounds quite benign, doesn't it? If you have a right to choose to die, I no longer have a right not to choose. I now have to choose to live or choose to die. But I can't just be valuable. A judgment call has to be made on my life. And lots of things going on at the moment. I think death is very sanitized. I'm not sure. If we do a show of hands here, how many people have seen a dead body? So you are incredibly unusual nationally. And because actually the vast majority of people have never met someone, who've never watched someone die. They've never had a body laid out in the living room like we used to. They've never looked. And we're so far removed from death. There's a huge anxiety around death. And we hear all these awful stories, and goodness, there are some sad stories. And you'll probably have heard them on the Today programme and Radio Merseyside and seen them in the papers. There are some horrendous stories. But what we are telling are stories of a minority which are creating huge amounts of anxiety around death and dying. And we're not telling the stories that are harder to tell, of the quiet deaths, of the people who are correctly not undergoing interventions, who are making different choices. And because we're anxious, the natural reaction is to try and take control, because that's what we do, isn't it? We can control most things. We can control the lights with our phone. We can control things with our voices. Everything's very instant and quick. And surely if we can just control death, we can deal with that anxiety rather than face our own mortality. By way of illustration, I look after people generally between the ages of 65 and 105. And I see a lot of quite sad things in presentation to our unit. So we've diagnosed somebody with an incurable brain tumour in her late 60s this week. But I also looked after an 104-year-old recently who had been in hospital for the second time in her life and had only been unwell for 2 months. And she turned to me, and I generally consider myself a compassionate individual, but she turned to me and she said, "It's so unfair. It's so unfair that you're telling me that I might die." And I thought, blimey. I mean, I appreciate we've got in Formby the oldest lady in the Northwest. She turned 111 yesterday. She lives in Formby. Matt's met her. It's minor celebrity. And so we know people live a long time. People live well. But we do need to face our own mortality, don't we? It is coming. Whether it comes when we're 20 or, 92, it is coming. So let's not be anxious. I want to argue that our response as Christians then should be motivated really by 3 things. And I've tried very hard to do the evangelical alliterative thing. And I'm not a vicar, so that's been quite tricky. But we've come up with clarity, Christ, and compassion. So our response as Christians to all of this can be motivated by clarity because we know who we are and we know who God is. And we're going to look at that a bit more in little groups together. We can be motivated by Christ because in Christ, God has spoken to us, hasn't he? He's revealed himself to us. He's revealed his heart to us. And he's shown us the extent of his love for us. And also we can be motivated by compassion because God is love, isn't he? And if we live in God, we live in love. So I hope we're going to be able to show you a better way.
Okay, so it's time to do some work again. If you need to stand up and do a stretch, or you need to grab another drink or stuff like that, please do. How many have got? 1, 2, 3, 4, kind of roughly about 4 groups, 5 groups even, if I can count. Why don't we pick one each? So this table down here near the front, do you want to do Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27? Table slightly behind, do you want to do Genesis 9, 5 to 6? Middle table, do you want to do Psalm 24, verse 1-ish? Back table, do you want to do Psalm 139, verses 13 to 16? And front table, which one would you like to do? Do you want to do Genesis 9 maybe, something like that? Great. Oh, great, thank you. Things change. Okay, I'm going to interrupt there. Sorry about that. I can say, do jot down these verses if you'd like, because I think they're well worth thinking through. What? Okay, yeah, or we can send them through. We'll pass them on to Andy. So, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 27. Shall I quickly read them? Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. So this table here, I think Andy's got the microphone. What does God tell us about who we are from these verses? Yeah.
I think
No worries. Okay. Sorry.
God made mankind in his image.
Yes.
Male and female, he created them. Now, what that actually means by being in God's image is a further discussion, but we're not just random blobs that evolved.
Yep.
We have been made in God's image, every single person on earth.
Yeah, yeah. And if it doesn't sound heretical, there's something about us that is God-like. There's something about us that's God-like. Or if you compare it with verse 26, we're created in God's image, but the animals aren't. We're to rule over them. We're different from them. So there is that difference. It's not like just going to the vet and giving an injection. There's something different about us made in God's image. Thank you very much. Okay, Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 to 6. I'll quickly read that out. Chapter 9. So this is to Noah after he's out of the ark, and it says, "And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind." Okay, table towards the back. What did you make of this?
Yeah, we weren't sure about the beginning of verse 6.
Sure.
Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed.
Yep.
Obviously, you've got the repetition of made in God's image. But verse 5 it just seemed to be saying that God made us and we're responsible to him. We can't just choose what we do with our lives.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the right line?
Yeah, I think that's really is it. So there's this idea that we have been created in God's image. There's something special about us. And therefore, human beings shouldn't be killed, shouldn't be murdered. That if anyone murders another human being, there'll be an accounting for their life. There'll be a punishment. And actually, in this case, it's going to be death. It's that serious. And actually, what's even quite surprising as well is if a human being is killed by an animal, actually that animal is going to be punished as well. It's so serious to take someone's life. And the reason why is because we're made in God's image. There's something special about us. So our life shouldn't be just treated as if there's nothing special about it. Okay, thank you very much. So that's Genesis 9. Psalm 24. Great. Tell you what, so it's 24 verse 1. So the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. What does that tell us about who we are?
When I heard that, it made me think immediately of the 1 Corinthians verse where our bodies, we're not our own.
Yep.
Our bodies belong to God. We're temples of the Holy Spirit.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
we belong to God. It's not for us to destroy anything or kill anything.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not our choice. It's up to God. Great. Thank you very much. And that brings us quite nicely into Psalm 139. So it's verses 13 to 16. I'll quickly read them out. David's talking about how he was created and his life, and he says, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." And talks about how precious God's thoughts are. So what do we learn about ourselves from Psalm 139, these verses? Any thoughts?
Really just sort of verse 13, all the verses, but particularly 13 where it said, "You knit me together in my mother's womb."
Yeah.
He was there from before we sort of existed, sort of thing, so he's always been there, so that was pretty amazing,
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Even before, from the moment we were conceived, God was there knitting us together. What about, there's a special book in verse 16. Anyone else who's got it open as well?
Our days were planned.
Yeah, go for it.
it was God was there at the beginning before, you know, it talks about our unformed bodies. So before the 12-week scans,
Yes. Yes.
he'd already been there.
Yeah.
And the days and are the days of our lives are planned. He's ordained them and written them.
Yeah.
And logically then on from that, he's going to be there. If he was there before they came to be, he's going to be there when they finished.
Yeah.
It's just this completeness of God's, I think, right, sorry, at the end of the psalm it goes on, it's like I can't go anywhere to get away from you.
Yeah.
You're always there. And
Yeah, the Lord is the one who's in control. You know, we saw Psalm 24, we're the Lord's, we're not our own. You know, New Testament reminds us we're bought at a price if we're Christians. And this one talks to us wonderfully about how God has numbered every single one of our days. He's got it all planned out. So actually, who should be deciding when we die? It's God, not us. It's his decision because he's the one who owns us. Okay, so that's the first thing. Think about who we are. We're God's. We're made in God's image. So let's see, next one. What does God tell us about his relationship to his people and his heart for them? So I'm going to give out some, so we do same groups. So if you guys look at 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 6 at the front, at the back, Jeremiah 10:23, in the middle, John chapter 10, and then at this side, Matthew chapter 18. And you guys at the front, if you just want to pick one at random, is that okay? Okay, you guys ready to feed back? Maybe, maybe not. Don't worry if you're not quite sure, that's absolutely fine. Actually, I'm just going to check this table down at the front. Which passage did you guys pick? The last one. Okay, I'll jump on you for the last one then this time. So, 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 6. It's Hannah's prayer before she gives birth to Samuel. And she says, where is it? The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. So, you might not be able to answer all of this question from that one verse, but do you want to just mention a few things that you were talking about?
Is it on?
Yes.
As Keith said, I think this passage just shows that everything, our lives begin and end with God.
Begin and end with God, yeah. So he's at the very start, he's at the very end. He's decided he's in control. Great. Okay, table behind. I'm just going to quickly read for you Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 23. Jeremiah, he's praying and he says, Lord, I know that people's lives are not their own. It is not for them to direct their steps. Okay, table, what does this tell us about God's relationship with us?
Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? You know, our lives are not our own. We're not in charge. He is. And it's not actually up to us to choose what we're doing with our lives.
Yeah.
It's up to him.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Okay, middle table, John chapter 10. I'll just quickly flick there and I'll read it out for a second. John chapter 10, verse 14 to 18, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheepfold. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. Okay, so God's relationship with his people.
Jesus laid down his life for us doesn't mean that we can take our own life. He laid down his life for us and took all our suffering on him. By laying down our life, we can't take other people's suffering on us. Only Jesus can do that. So we're not to lay down our life. He laid it down for us, for our benefit, and because he loves us so much.
Yeah. So he loves us so much. It's the gospel there, isn't it? It's the good news about Jesus, what he's done for us. And how he cares for us. He cares for us so much, even in the midst of that suffering and other things, that he's laid down his life for us. Okay, Matthew chapter 18. I will just, 18, 1 to 5. Thank you for remembering that was this table. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. Okay, what does that tell us about our relationship with God, with Jesus?
Is it on?
Yep.
That we should have childlike trust and dependence on him, and know that the certainty he'll take care of us, like children expect that of their parent.
Yeah. I think that's key, isn't it? It's that dependence, that childlike trust, that this person knows what's best for me. I'm going to do what they say. I trust them. I think that kind of ties in with the gospel, doesn't it? God, Jesus, they're in control, not me. I can't save myself. I can't make myself right with God. Jesus is the one who can do that. Jesus knows everything. Okay, I'm going to try and be a bit faster now. last bit, what does God tell us about love and dependence? So this isn't just depending on God, but kind of our horizontal relationships. So 1 John chapter 3, verse 16, Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, Psalm 82, verse 3 and 4, James chapter 1, verse 27, and whichever one you guys find first. Oh, sorry? Yeah, as long as those go. Everyone will be happy. Cool. Oh, sorry. Okay, guys, you ready to share with everyone some of the things you've been thinking about? So, 1 John chapter 3, verse 16, John writes, "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters." So what does that tell us about love and dependence?
I guess it shows our dependence on Jesus firstly, and then secondly also, I guess it gives us a sort of metaphorical example of how to sort of love others as well.
Yeah, great. So it's because Jesus died for us, that's why we rely on him, and therefore we should be willing to give up our lives, not to kill ourselves. It's a bit unfortunate the way the verse uses that metaphor, but actually to be so willing to give things up for other people, it's almost like that. Okay, then Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. Let's see. Paul writes, 6 verse 2. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. So, table over here. What do you make of that?
Well, carry each other's burdens, we're saying it's helping people, getting alongside people, and just being there for them. It may mean sacrificing, it may mean giving things up in order to be able to help another believer. But that's, we need to be dependent on each other, and not be afraid to share those burdens as well.
Yeah.
To allow ourselves to be helped.
Yeah. I think that's really important, isn't it? Carry each other's burden. It's both sides. It's giving a bit of your burden, and it's receiving someone else's burden. There is the danger, I'm thinking when I walk my sons to school every day, carry your own bags. We don't really want to do that, do we? Partly that's obviously me training them up to be good citizens. Carry your own bags. But actually there's a danger, isn't there, that then in life we get so used to being, I can do it myself. Leave me alone, I can do it myself. But actually that's not the Christian way. We're supposed to be sharing. Those of us who are doing okay, we lift up the people who aren't doing so well. And those of us who aren't doing so well, well, actually we're happy to be helped by other people as well. That's normal for Christians to be. Okay, Psalm 82, verses 3 and 4. Asaph says, defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Okay, so middle table, how does this build on what we've been thinking?
This is literally is everything, isn't it? It just says everything against what you were saying about getting rid of, or saying that people's lives aren't worth anything, aren't worth living, so we can take it away. This is saying completely the opposite. It's saying defend them, stand up for them. You're to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. And worse than that, it says that the people who don't are wicked. That if you don't do that, then you're not standing up for them. You're wicked. You're not doing the right thing.
Thank you. It's really helpful, isn't it? Okay, and then lastly, James chapter 1, verse 27. Okay, so religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So what do you guys make of this one?
We're thinking in this context, orphans and widows are those in James's society would be very, very vulnerable, they'd be voiceless, nobody to speak up for them and look out for them. And so it's applying that to those in our society in the same situation. And I think to keep oneself from being polluted by the world is to make sure that you're living towards by God's standards and not by what the world would say, as in, they're widows, orphans, we don't care about them. It's like, oh yes, we do.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful, isn't it? Yeah, that widows and orphans, people who are struggling in this world at both ends of the scale, who are oppressed, looking after them. And as you say at the end of that verse, it's quite poignant, is that it says, don't be polluted by the world, because it's so easy in these discussions to think, well, maybe all those, people who are pro-euthanasia, pro-assisted suicide, maybe there is something about what they're saying. And James is saying, no, remember what the Bible says. Don't get polluted, because it's so easy to fall and to think that that's actually the right way. So I guess that clarity, we're made in God's image. Everything is the Lord's. We're the Lord's. We're owned by Him. He's the one who's numbered our days. God has made us. Our lives aren't our own. But Jesus, He's the Good Shepherd. He's the one who cares for us. It means that we're able to be like children with their parents, just completely dependent, completely accepting that God knows what's right, God's going to care for us and look after us. And then that kind of flows out, doesn't it, to our relationship with other people. We carry each other's burdens. We defend those who are weak, we defend those who are oppressed, who are distressed, and we're even ready to lay down our lives for them in loving them So as Liz comes, a quick show of hands if you've heard of the Terminally Ill Adults Bill. I think you might have, because Liz has mentioned it already. I'm guessing some of us might have heard a bit about it, or not. Liz is now going to do a very quick kind of run through of it and let you know a bit more.
But most of you don't know me, but you also know that I've always got an extra word. So I just wanted to add to the bit where we looked about how Jesus is our shepherd and how he knows us intimately. That might have put you in mind of Psalm 23, and it is our shepherd who walks through the valley of the shadow of death with us. And so as we approach death with fear and trepidation, because actually it is not what we are made for, is it? It's a mark of the fall. And we know the one who has gone through death before us, and we know the one who promises to walk with us in that valley. So, next thing we're going to do then, I apologise, this is tiny. This is just a snippet from the very beginning of the bill, which was published at the end of November. As I've alluded to already, it's pretty dreadfully written, but the sort of key points of it are that assisted dying is to be offered to those adults, so over 18s, who are terminally ill, and later on they define that as someone with 6 months or less to live, who have the mental capacity to make that decision. And that's a very specific legal thing that invokes the Mental Capacity Act, which was not designed for this purpose. And I guess we might have a bit more knowledge of that in the corner here with our ex-social worker. But it's a slightly unusual choice of things. But it allows people who fulfill those criteria and who are ordinarily resident in England or Wales to make a request, which is to be voluntary, if they have a clear, settled wish to end their life, and we are happy that they've not been coerced or pressured. So, in terms of the sort of medical temperature, things have changed quite a lot in the past 10 years or so. There's a range of opinions within medicine. Those most in favour of this are typically those most removed from caring for people at the end of their lives. So palliative care physicians on the whole, although not exclusively, and geriatricians are still opposed officially. Our national societies have maintained opposition, where many others like the Royal College of Physicians and sadly more recently the Royal College of General Practitioners have gone neutral, which for lots of people is tacit agreement. But all people within the medical profession acknowledge that there will be a shift within the clinician-patient relationship if this law is to come into force. So I wanted to try and talk a little bit about different aspects of the bill which have given many people anxiety, and safeguards has been a problem for people who are both ethically in favour of and also against assisted dying. So there's been huge anxiety around safeguarding regardless of people's ethical stance. And Kim Ledbetter made a huge amount about how this was going to be the safest bill in the world. It was going to be so much better than everybody else's because the Brits can do something that nobody else has managed. And assisted dying is in over 32 jurisdictions internationally. I can give you all their reports, and they've all got problems. So the original bill that MPs voted on in November included that provision of a High Court judge, which sounded marvellous and everybody thought was a panacea to make sure nothing awful happened. And I suspect we've got different MPs. My MP is Bill Esterton, and he's historically been opposed to assisted dying bill on the basis of inadequate safeguards, and in 2015 he voted against it. But this time he was persuaded by Kim Ledbetter's rhetoric that there would be adequate safeguarding, and so he's voted in favour of it and roundly refuses to meet me. But throughout the committee stage, there have been real concerns about court backlogs and how many judges we actually have. So they've got rid of the need for the High Court judge, which was the thing that had reassured everybody. And they've replaced it with an assisted suicide SAR, who will oversee a voluntary assisted dying commissioner, who will oversee panels of 3 people, who will be a lawyer, a social worker, and goodness, if they can find one, a psychiatrist. The state of psychiatry in Britain, blimey, we are very short of psychiatrists. And the lovely Alan House, who's a very eminent professor of psychiatry in Leeds, did put his hand up in committee and say, I'm not sure we've got the psychiatrists to do this. But anyway, he was completely ignored. The other anxiety within this little panel of people is that there will not have to be unanimity of opinion on the panel. So if one person thinks that the procedure is warranted, the other two people can choose to abstain, and as long as they don't object, somebody can be approved for assisted dying on the basis of one person's say-so with two people not being sure. If we move on, this is a bit of a wordy thing, but I'm quite proud of this because this is part of my work from last year. And the bit I really want to draw your attention to is we looked at everybody's data, and we looked at the rates of unlawful death, so people where people's procedures hadn't been followed. And the Netherlands is taken to be like a really shining example of a modern, well-run assisted dying service. And their 0.1% of their deaths in 22 and 0.05% of their deaths in 23 occurred without fulfilment of the due care criteria, i.e. the safeguards were ignored, so those people were unlawfully killed. You can look at the detail of that because the Netherlands publishes loads of data, they're very open. But if I were to talk to you about a medical procedure, if I were to be offering you an intervention and I said to you there's a 0.1% risk of death, I would have to tell you that's a moderate risk. So there is a moderate risk of death when you shouldn't die in a modern, well-run AD service, and for me that is unacceptable. Nothing we've seen at the committee stage has been remotely reassuring, predominantly because everybody who objected had very little opportunity to speak, and when they did speak they were ridiculed or dismissed as not experts in their fields, despite being amongst some of the most revered people in their fields. There were 500 plus amendments tabled. You can imagine the committee was difficult, but less than 1 in 5 of those, less than 20%, proposed by those opposing the bill were agreed. And that is really telling of the process actually that's happened, because typically you need to satisfy the opponents of a bill and you make it robust because they help you to make the bill more robust. And the sense really among committee here was just that there was a real refusal to hear. I think 80% of people who were allowed to give oral evidence were pro, and some framed it as the opportunity to prevent suicide, that this was a suicide prevention initiative, which boggles my brain a little bit. Sorry, just going back a slide actually, because I skated over it, but this is quite useful if you're thinking about talking to your MPs. We'll come on to later. I just wanted to highlight any doctor can bring up ending your life. They don't have to be a specialist in the condition which is limiting your life. They don't have to give you the most up-to-date treatment options. The independent oversight safeguard is gone, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And there's no real clarity on how people will be trained, whether there'll be a cap on the number of cases of suicide that you can administer. And what we see internationally is that there's a very small minority of doctors administering a huge amount of death. I don't know, did anybody watch Liz Carr's documentary on the BBC? It was on around the time the bill was read, October, November, and it's actually just been repeated on Tuesday, I think it was, so you might be able to watch that again on iPlayer. It's called Better Off Dead. Liz Carr, the actress, she's been in Silent Witness and various things. She's about as secular as they come, but is vehemently opposed to this. And she interviewed a Canadian doctor who has killed over 200 people on her couch since this started, and was so proud of her work and said it's the most fulfilling work she's done. So there are always outliers within our profession who will be drawn towards this. And so to say that doctors are generally nice human beings, I mean, is nice to hear, but it's not true. And that's why we need some better safeguards. I think alongside safeguarding, there's huge concerns around palliative and end-of-life care. And again, I'm sorry that this is so small, but I will read to you. Essentially, repeated reference is made throughout the bill to available palliative hospice or other care, including symptom management, psychological support. And we know that palliative care can be fantastic for dealing with non-physical symptoms. But the government's own briefing paper in 2022 thinks that there are 100,000 people every year in the UK who die without access to the palliative care that they need. The data from Marie Curie suggests that 1 in 4 people who need to access palliative care cannot access the palliative care that they need. And historically, the government's provided about 1/3 of palliative care funding. The remainder is from people jumping out of planes and baking cakes, which which is astonishing, really. And it is particularly of concern when we think about the vulnerable and the weak, because if you are in an affluent area, you have better palliative care because people bake more cakes and jump out of more planes. And if you are in a racially diverse area or a socially deprived area, your access to palliative care is severely limited, and therefore we're adding to a burden already on those people who may be struggling to access the help and support that they need and the healthcare that they need, by suggesting that there's another cheaper way. So what I would say is that I don't believe that we're currently offering people a real choice. And when we're saying to them, you can have palliative care or you can die, we can say you can have whatever palliative care is available, and that's somebody on a phone once a month. It's not terribly helpful, is it? Thinking more widely about care, I guess I've got ahead of myself, but I just don't think this should ever be part of routine medical care. It's not care in my mind. And I think it will very easily be extended to groups that we seek to protect. And somebody actually asked a question already, which I think has been on all of our minds, that if the bill is passed, what is there to stop further iterations of the bill to legalise assisted dying for others not currently provided for within the bill, such as young people with mental health problems, or, as is debated in Canada, the euthanasia of children? Well, the Netherlands and Belgium already euthanize children. The logical conclusion of all of this is that anybody can have this at any point. It makes ethically no sense that you have to be terminally ill and suffer for 6 months. What if you're terminally ill for 4 years? You've been diagnosed with motor neuron disease. Dear friend just died of motor neuron disease earlier this year, and he's known he's going to die for some time. Why does he have to wait till 6 months? It makes no sense. So it will only be a matter of time before High Court appeals and human rights laws are invoked to extend the scope of this bill. So now is the time to try and stop this before it starts. I think we've sort of touched on that really, but just to highlight that Rachel Maskell, one of the Labour MPs, asked to have an amendment that would mean care homes and hospices could be exempt from this. That was voted down. There is no provision for any institutional exemption if and when this bill is enacted. You will not be able to refuse to do this if you are a hospice, and there have been threats made to government funding over that. You will not be allowed to refuse if you're a care home or a hospital. So those of us who thought, oh, we might set up a little geriatric Christian hospital where you could be sure that nobody would offer to do this to you, that's not going to be an option. Just looking again at sort of end-of-life care, although lots of the international data suggests that people have seen a palliative care physician, if we look at the Canada data, fewer than half the patients who had MAID, which is their version of assisted dying, saw a specialist palliative care team, and the access to publicly funded palliative care is pretty minimal. Again, in Australia even, which is often shown as a sort of more modern, more recent thing, the Australian MPs gave evidence to committee about how wonderful their service was. Almost 60% of their patients are not getting end-of-life care services before they're referred for this. Coercion's probably the other thing you've heard mentioned. Coercion and control, really difficult things, aren't they, to pick up in all sorts of spheres of life. The CPS website is so long, I have no idea how they expect me to detect this. I mean, as a geriatrician, I have the privilege of spending quite a long time with my patients. So if I do a home visit, I could spend an hour with somebody in their own home with their families. But actually, even then, it's really hard for me to pick those dynamics up. Really, really tricky. And we often see pressure, whether that's perceived or actual, on people perhaps just to give up their home and go into care. And so you can only imagine what might be going on if people have got more to gain. Lots of our patients worry about being burdensome. Lots of them say, oh, I don't want to take up your time, doctor. I don't know why you're spending so much time looking after me. I've had my life. And if I can then say to them, well, do you know what? That's true, isn't it? We could use this this healthcare money and ability on somebody else. Do you want a pill? It's chilling, isn't it? About half of people internationally, if you look on average, cite being a burden as the main reason for wanting to die. So We've got lots of problems, haven't we, in terms of our NHS and social care that I've just alluded to. People worry about taking up resource, and people who are in the end stages of their life do take up a lot of our resources. People spend a lot of time with healthcare contact in the last years of life. It's expensive. People might move into care homes. I suspect many of you are aware it's probably £1,800 a week for a decent care home place, maybe £2,000 a week. If you're in Canada and you want MAID, it costs you $2,000 and you're done. That's quite a financial incentive for people who want to save their family's money, as well as people who are grabbing. You know, I heard my dad say once, well, if I knew I was going to die and I knew I could avoid you wasting all that money, you could have that money for something else, couldn't you? And he's a Christian with his bags packed, he knows where he's going. But that plays on people's minds, doesn't it? How can I provide for those I love? Will I have to sell my home? How will I pay for that care in my last years of life? And then I wanted to mention depression, which is really underdiagnosed. So around 4% of older community-dwelling adults will suffer with depression. That proportion is higher in those patients who have coexistent dementia or coexistent terminal illness. And we don't currently screen well for it or treat it. And we know that suicide is a part of depression at one end of the extreme, and this is where we've got the sort of almost false dichotomy of rational suicides. How can we decide whether your suicidal ideation is because you are aware that you've got 6 months less to live and you don't want the indignity and this is all your choice, or whether it's because actually life just feels so impossible? There's no way you could go on. It might not truly be a choice. I think just to highlight this little interaction between Danny Kruger and Kim Ledbetter. So Danny Kruger's been vehemently opposed to assisted dying. He's done some fantastic work in committee stage at pointing out the really blatant flaws. And he said to Kim Ledbetter, would the Honourable Lady be content if somebody who had capacity to choose an assisted death for the purpose of saving their family money? And Kim Ledbetter sort of stuttered for a bit and then said, well, ultimately it's a question of choice for patients, isn't it? And so actually we're faced, aren't we, with this perfect reality that the proponents of the bill believe we live in, where there are rational people making choices about how to die on the basis of their personal preferences, completely free from any undue influence. And then we've got the real world where I live and work, where there's all kinds of social and psychological and financial forces that are acting on all of us all the time and influencing our decisions. So the bill could facilitate the deaths then of people who live in costly care homes who want an assisted death to protect their children's dwindling inheritance. Finally, I mentioned before, institutions are not going to be able to opt out. Individual doctors will have a duty to refer. It's not clear what will be the case for nurses. It's unclear if we will have a duty to mention it as a treatment option, which I think really risks the destruction of my working relationship with patients. And certainly if it's something that I am forced to do by law, I will leave medicine. And I say that with a heavy heart because I love medicine. They refused an amendment to prevent doctors raising assisted dying to people who hadn't thought about it. And we know that the way you raise things with patients really frames it for them. And palliative care specialists who are being interviewed said, well, look, that could be construed as a sort of coercion. We know there's an imbalance of power within a doctor-patient relationship. Just the mere suggestion of it is enough to make some people think they ought to. And MenCap were really, really worried by those statements as well, as they should be. Finally, a few other cheerful bits. Sorry, this is not meant to be a total Debbie Downer of an evening, but it's not clear how these services would run. The bill is very, very vague on any of the specifics. It's all very much in beta, which is very odd, because this should all have been ironed out at committee stage, and the new bill hasn't done that. So they've published the updated post-committee stage bill. It may be that private clinics run this. It's not been ruled out that they could be running this for a profit rather than being a non-profit organisation. I've talked a bit about problems with staffing. In the bill in its current form, a medic has to stay with the patient while they die. Time to death is up to 5 days, anything from 5 hours to 5 days in 50% of patients, from Oregon's data, and they've got incomplete data, but they're probably the most honest. So 50% of patients will die in less than 5 hours, but the other 50%, who knows? There's not a huge amount on what the ambulance service are to do if they are called to somebody who has an incomplete suicide. There's no guidance because this is not an evidence-based treatment on what medication should be used when and how. We know what's used internationally. We know that it's quite problematic. A brief Google will bring you up the patient information leaflet for Washington, which explains how to make the medicine taste less bitter, what you are and aren't allowed to eat for how many hours beforehand, and what to do if you start feeling sick after you've taken the medicine. So it's not benign, peaceful death necessarily that we're being sold it to be. The oversight situation is pretty interesting. It was meant to be the chief medical officer who would oversee that, but now the Assisted Dying Commissioner will take their place, and they will be appointed by the Prime Minister, who supports a change in the law, and there will be an authority that the Commissioner oversees, where people can appeal if their request for assisted dying is refused, and they can decide if anybody's made any mistakes on the panel at that point and overturn those decisions. But it is, as Naz Shah from the committee said, rather like they're marking their own homework. This is not an independent body, and so that's a huge concern. There's also no right to appeal for family and friends, so there is no requirement for family or friends to be told about any of this. There is a recommendation that they should be told, but if you find out that your loved one wants to do this and you believe there to have been an error in the process that has accepted them for it, you cannot appeal. Finally, just 3 sort of other categories which are perhaps less relevant to me in my role, but certainly causing concern to other medical staff. There was an amendment tabled for people with eating disorders, particularly given the state of our eating disorder service in the country. People have often got unacceptable weights, and some people are being put into induced comas pending access to services to prevent them from dying. Eating disorders have not been exempted, so they will be included within this bill. People with Down syndrome are protected in law via the Down Syndrome Act, and there are certain provisions and protections that they have with respect to medical treatments, and assisted dying will be exempted from having to comply with the Down Syndrome Act, again, because that amendment was thrown out. And then finally, people were looking for some reassurances around domestic abuse, so there's been some figures published recently around intimate partner homicide and suicide and the relationship between domestic violence and completed suicides. And again, there's no provision made within the bill for the protection of those vulnerable folk. So, hopefully I've horrified you enough that you want to do something about this. April the 25th, we believe, will be the report stage when Kim Ledbetter will present to the Houses of Parliament. There'll be at least an hour of consideration and possibly a vote on that day, but what's looking more likely at the moment is that that vote may well be delayed till mid-May, in which case that gives us a little bit more time to talk and to lobby. If you are looking for what you personally can do next, I mean, I don't say it lightly, but pray, please pray, because we believe in a God who can change things. There have been some signs that this bill will be harder to push through, so the fact that it's now going to have an up to 4-year implementation period might take it past the next general election, might make it an election issue rather than purely a private member's bill. But do pray as well for those who have been standing against this bill. They've received a lot of flack. Do be lifting them up, as well as praying for people's eyes to be opened as to the potential harms of this bill, that people would see the vast swathes of our population who will become vulnerable if this bill becomes law. But also, please meet with your MP. If your MP has already voted against the bill, please thank them for that. Please encourage them that you still want them to keep voting against this bill. If they've voted already and they don't appear at report stage and there is a vote that day, then that increases the chances of the bill passing through. So again, just encouraging them to vote. 650 MPs will need to vote on this, and it's being done on a Friday afternoon when lots of people are going back to their constituencies typically. So please ask people to stay and take part when the vote does happen. if your MP hasn't expressed a preference or has been for it, it's worth having a conversation with them as to what swayed them to vote for it, have a listen to them, but also talk to them and tell them your views. Because although my MP keeps repeating to me that this is a conscience issue, they are your elected representatives and they need to hear from you what your concerns are and what you think. We're going to do a little bit of question and answer. I'm so sorry because I know we've overstayed our welcome slightly. And I have got a slide at the end with some resources for you if you want help and support to write to MPs and things. But I think I'll stop there and say, does anybody have any questions? And then the person who asked this question, or anybody, if they want to come back on what I said about extension of the bill, please feel free to ask follow-up questions.
Right, thank you so much. Questions? Why don't you just kind of turn 30 seconds and just what's the kind of the burning question? If you've got a chance to do that, so just turn to the people on your tables. What question would you ask? 30 seconds, and then we might, and then we'll share some of those. And then be like, it's my wife. Sorry. Who's got a question? Who's got a question? Suzanne's got a question. Suzanne's got a question.
I'm strongly with Christian point of view.
Can I just give you that? Just because we can hear it on the live stream.
Okay, 100% take the Christian viewpoint. But I mentioned it to somebody on Sunday, and we were sat talking, and she said, yes, but I work in a care home, and I see that people are being kept alive, and they have no quality of life. How can I answer people if they say that to me? How can I reconcile that in my mind?
I guess there's a few things within that, aren't there, that need to be unpacked. So one is around how we make judgments about other people's lives. And some of that is around personal experience and some of that is around ignorance. So you've met one person who's paralysed from the waist down or who is immobile. You've met one person who's paralysed from the waist down or is immobile. There was a young rugby player, wasn't there, in his early 20s, about 15, 20 years ago, who was paralysed in a training accident. And he made repeated attempts on his life through neuro rehab, and when he got home, and his parents took him to Switzerland in the end, and he died. And then you've got perhaps more famously someone like Joni Eareckson-Tada, who had exactly the same spinal injury and chose life to be worth living. So I guess making judgments based on the external is always a dangerous thing. And certainly I know that to be true amongst my patients. I've got patients who are physically and mentally very severely impaired at times who still choose life and would still choose life because they have pleasure. I think the second thing to say, and we haven't really touched on, is what is the place of suffering and how do we respond to suffering as Christians? Because culturally, suffering is the ultimate evil. I don't say this lightly. I had a period of quite profound ill health a couple of years ago where it was difficult even to eat. And by the Lord's grace, I am significantly better than that because I'm standing here today. And I don't pretend to have plumbed the depth of suffering. But the Christian narrative is that suffering is not worthless. That there is something within suffering, which is not therefore that we want to prolong suffering, because surely we need to have that compassion and love and we alleviate whatever suffering we can. But suffering is not the meaningless evil that the secular world sees it as. And then I think finally we touch back, don't we, into how the Lord has made us. So there is an inherent dignity in being an image bearer, no matter how marred. And that is not to take away from the ravages of things like dementia, which may well be seen in care homes, particularly if your friend works there. Care homes can be pretty miserable places. And part of that is because as a society we don't believe they should be better. We don't pay the people that work in them well. We don't hold them to high standards. Truthfully, there are very few care homes I would put my own family members in. And that's a real damning indictment, isn't it? And no wonder people look there and think, gosh, would they be better off dead? Does that help? Thanks for thank you for sharing that. And actually, some of what you highlight there is really important, isn't it? So one thing that doctors are not always very good at, and as geriatricians we try and pride ourselves on, is balancing the benefits and burdens of treatment. So just because I don't think assisted dying is right, I don't believe in life at all costs. And so what we want to do for our patients, particularly those who are struggling with progressive conditions like your mum, is to say, okay, well, what are the benefits of the things that you're taking? What are the things that make you feel better, that make life better? And what are the things that don't? And one of my favourite jobs as a geriatrician is to stop medicines, because they get started and they never get stopped. And it's so satisfying, and people feel better off them a lot of the time. Not all of them, I don't stop everything. But recognising, as you say, what treatments are going to be helpful and what aren't. But it is hard. No, so it's a recognition of a phenomenon called polypharmacy, which is when you're on 5 or more medications, your risk of falls particularly dramatically increases, and your risk of side effects as you age increases. And what often happens is people are started on medications when they're younger and more robust, and then as they age, you metabolize medication differently. Different medicines can accumulate. We've had patients diagnosed with dementia who have been taken off certain medications and the diagnosis has been removed because they can have such significant effects on cognition. So it's about recognizing and rationalizing treatment and looking at a whole person. Because usually you meet an ologist who looks after hearts or lungs or kidneys, and I look after whole people. It's quite fun.
Also, just getting back to that about, they're in a care home, their quality of life's rubbish, surely just put them out of their misery. And it comes back to those bits about dignity, but also on Christians being at the forefront of things. So, years ago, maybe street children, worthless, just ignore them. Old people, we'll put them in a care home and then won't have to look at them anymore. But actually, as Christians, should we not be thinking, do you know what? There's people in care homes who are lonely. Why don't we arrange between all the local churches a visit thing? Why don't we maybe chat to some of the local schools so that the kids can come in and mix with them? In the same way that in the past, ministers at the forefront of, Christians were at the forefront of abolishing slavery. It was on a different continent, let's not think about it. No, this is wrong, let's not do that. Christians were at the forefront of the Sunday school movement, which turned into schools and things like that. So I think it probably is a time actually for us as Christians to say, this isn't right. Society's just trying to ignore it. Well, actually, we should be stepping up at this point and making a difference to people so that actually it's not a life's so bad, maybe it's easier if they ignore it.
Other questions? Yeah, great. you want me to read it out? Or you too much? Okay. Do you know, are there any Christians involved in the legal process of the bill, political policy, etc., and can defend, oppose the bill? Or are we, I assume Christians not represented, any specific people to pray for?
So probably the highest profile is Tim Farron, isn't it? So he has very much worn his heart on his sleeve over the years and has lived a very public Christian life, and would hands up say he's not always got things right, but he's excellent on this. If any of you are podcast people, he does a podcast called A Mucky Business, where he interviews a variety of people. He's done several on assisted dying, so it's quite interesting to listen to. He's a true liberal and argues against it on the basis of his liberal politics as well as his Christian faith. In terms of sort of others to pray for, particularly from committee, Danny Kruger and Naz Shah have been very rational voices of opposition, and we've written to them as our duty of care to say thank you, keep going. Truthfully, I don't know all the Christians involved, but there have been, and as I say, I'm not sure that Danny Kruger and Naz Shah are necessarily people who would share our faith, but they certainly share our concern for the vulnerable and our concerns around this bill. So yeah, I think the minority of the committee were opposed. So it was a committee appointed by Kim Ledbetter, predominantly of supporters of the bill, with a few significant opponents. Yeah, not sure if that answers your question very well, sorry. They have. Yeah, I can't remember if I've put theirs on here. I've put the Christian Concern one on. I've put Care Not Killings one on. There's a few resources, but you're absolutely right. And Christian Concern are holding weekly prayer meetings throughout Lent. I think they're on Wednesdays that you can join Zoom to pray around this and for this situation, if that's something that would be helpful for you.
My basic position is that I can't see how human beings can be in a position where they can decide these things. It's just a moral impossibility, isn't it? But I just wanted to ask you, just in terms of being a medical professional, because those of us who've worked in any sort of pastoral work have all watched situations in which medical professionals have decided that person has come to the end of their life and encouraged their body to go into the dying phase. You know, I've seen that, and that must be a heck of a responsibility. But one of the things that crops up with this is those people who are in insufferable, incurable terminal pain, with no intervention helping with that. What's your sort of moral view on the medical profession perpetuating that?
I just wanted to clarify, you said you put people into the dying phase. Do you mean by not doing things, sort of?
I mean, for instance,
or do you mean when people get given analgesia and sedation?
I'm not a medical person, so I kind of only see the, I don't see the knowledgeable side. But I mean, if, for instance, somebody that's elderly, if you decide that you're going to withdraw fluids, then everybody knows that within 3 days or so that person will pass away. All I'm meaning to illustrate really is that the medical profession make judgments which lead to termination generally. So, but to go on to the other thing, there are a limited amount, small amount of circumstances where there is insufferable pain and distress that somebody's in, and then the question is, do you perpetuate that? Do you let it go on? Or is there a situation where you would do the same thing and encourage the body to come to an end?
So I guess there's two things there. I know your sort of first bit was trying to illustrate your question, but I do want to go back to that, because it sounds like perhaps a fairly common misconception that was rife around the time of the Liverpool Care Pathway. So there's quite a big body of evidence now around fluid requirements at the end of life. So if you're recognised to be entering the dying phases of your life, whether that is short weeks to days, you eat less, your fluid requirements are less, and you spend more time sleeping to recharge rather than eating and drinking. And so there's quite a lot of evidence of harm around ongoing intravenous or subcutaneous fluids to support people. So it's less that by stopping fluids you kill people, and more that by recognising that they are dying, their fluid requirements are less. So I just wanted to sort of push on that slightly, because I think that is something that worries families a lot, and it wasn't well explained historically. Thinking about those people whose suffering is very difficult, whose symptoms are very difficult to manage, truthfully, pain is rarely a huge issue nowadays. Not least because we've got the option of the doctrine of double effect, which is where we say our intention is to alleviate pain, not to shorten life. So you might see people having doses of medications right at the end of their life under the skin to relieve pain, with the full understanding that at a certain dose of that, their breathing will be less strong, as it were. Similarly, around things like terminal agitation, which can be quite a distressing symptom for families, but there are really good regimes out there. Truthfully, the most difficult pain to control at the end of life is psychological pain, and that's the one that we struggle most with through lack of access to psychological services, but also through spiritual pain that can be quite hard to address. Symptoms that are more difficult are things like intractable vomiting. That's a big one that can be really hard, but that affects such a tiny proportion of people. And in those scenarios, it's usually just a very, very person-intensive care. So it means having people constantly there with reassurance and cleaning and practical, not being left. And that palliative care, which actually originally was kind of how palliative care started, that we're not going to leave you, that we're going to sit with you in the pit, like Job's sufferers sat with him, that we are not going to leave you, you will not be alone in this. And I think we can't fail but to be moved by those situations. I think to be unmoved or to feel powerless in that situation would be to not be fully human. But for some things, there are no easy answers. But I want to stress that although the media would have us believe that's every other death, the truth is it's vanishingly uncommon nowadays with good palliative care. But again, with the caveat, with good palliative care, which 1 in 4 people can't access. So the distinctions drawn between the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment versus the active killing. So what you could say is, in a situation where that patient had become so poorly that they were unable to support their own organs anyway, if you just hadn't put them on the ventilator in the first place, you wouldn't have to turn it off. And that's what lies behind the decisions we make about who is appropriate for intensive care. So on every patient who I see who comes into the hospital, I make a judgment based on their physiology as to whether or not I think they would be able to survive being put on a ventilator. And if I don't think they could survive being put on a ventilator, then I will not suggest that they go to intensive care if their condition worsens. And that's what the intensive care physicians will also do, because actually being on a ventilator and having your kidneys replaced is a bit like doing a marathon. And if you are somebody who's accumulated multiple health deficits, you do not have the physiological reserve to run a marathon. And so I think what I would want to say is the majority of people who end up in intensive care now are the right people, unlike in the States where you pay, so you can have anybody on a ventilator for any length of time. But I think the distinction is between withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment versus active killing. So if in assisted suicide, you are taking somebody who is alive and very much alive and not dying, and you are choosing to kill them. Whereas in the situation of somebody who is brain dead, they have lost, they're effectively dead, as it were, and only being kept alive by your intervention. Does that? No. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, so sometimes we're not sure. So you might have somebody whose heart stops outside of hospital or who has a very serious brain injury or something like that, and we don't know in that situation whether there's any recovery. And we are all, well, most of us go to work trying to prolong life and to heal. And so the point of declaring somebody brain dead is necessarily quite complex, because what we don't want to do is do that to the wrong people. So there are people who will harvest organs. You can be a brain, if you're brain dead, you can sometimes be an organ donor. So there's a real conflict there if you're just not very rigorous about how you declare somebody's brainstem death. And that's why there's really quite a long process. It'd be really hard, because it can take days to weeks sometimes for that process to be completed. And that's difficult if you're on the other side of it waiting. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. What I'm going to do, we'll kind of draw something there, because I'm aware that some of you have got work. I mean, I've got work tomorrow. I don't know why I'm saying some of you. I'm a vicar, only work Sundays. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pray. If you've still got kind of comments and questions, you want to quickly grab these guys, then please do that. Thank you so much for coming this evening. It's been so informative. It's certainly kind of spurred me on to pray. And again, to keep on contacting MPs and things like that. So, and also the positive, actually, kind of what can we do? How, as Christians, can we actually positively care for the elderly? So let me pray. Thank you again so much. But let me pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the clarity which you give us in your word, your clarity about what it means to be made in your image, to be made as humans with dignity, to be made before you. Father, please continue to help us to be like Christ in seeking to lay down our lives for others, to serve others, to protect the weak and the vulnerable. Father, please would we increasingly have a voice and be willing to speak and to be heard and to pray. So Father, in our own lives, please show us the ways in which we can pray, in which we can speak, in which we can advocate. Whatever that may be for us, Father, please would we do that, and please equip us in the days and weeks ahead. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Yes, I do mention those.
Sorry, Andy's got books for you, and I love a good book. So two to plug. The first one is a very little one by Vaughan Roberts called Assisted Suicide. It was written in 2017. It's a little bit, it's got really helpful bits in it, but it's not quite as medically up to date as it could be, but it's still got quite a lot of value in reading it, and you can see how thin it is. You can get through that in an hour with a cup of coffee in a coffee shop, so definitely worth a read. The second one actually is even older. It's written in 2015 by John Wyatt, but it is fantastic, and by and large is still very, very accurate. It's just missing 10 years. So again, if you read this, you will recognise the historical section, which I have borrowed heavily from tonight, but there's some also really good stuff in there that I haven't spoken about, so very worth getting.
Fantastic. And what we'll do, we'll leave these around at the back, so if you don't want to get them tonight, you can get them on Sunday. Okay? Thank you so much. Yes.
And there are email tools that you can use on the Care Not Killing website. And then you mentioned Christian Institute as well. You literally can click and then you can edit and it goes by magic.
And tell your MP to chat to the other local MPs.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Why don't we give these guys a round of applause? Thank you so much. Thank you.